So good afternoon. So my name is Jerry Epstein, and I, along with Bob Poland, are co-directors of the Political Economy Research Institute. And I want to welcome everybody for coming to this event. Today it's my great privilege and honor to introduce Daniel Ellsberg. We're honored that Daniel has joined us here at Perry, and today is Daniel's inaugural lecture as Perry's first Distinguished Research Fellow. As many of you know, this is one of several events that Dan is going to be holding here at UMass over these few days. Tomorrow at 6 p.m. in the Campus Center Auditorium, Dan will be participating in an event celebrating his vast archive that has been given to UMass to be held in our archives in our library for future researchers and future activists who are interested in the important work that Dan has done and that he has observed. So this should be a very interesting event, 6 p.m. tomorrow night in the Campus Center Auditorium. Everybody is welcome. And last night, many of you were here to see the screening of the film about Dan, The Most Dangerous Man in America, an Academy Award-nominated film that featured Dan's role in revealing the Pentagon Papers. And you also saw the extremely moving and inspiring panel discussion that followed with Dan, his wife, Patricia, and two other members of the group that risked great personal danger to reveal the secrets of the Pentagon Papers to the public. This was the first event with Dan and two of his compadres, Janaki Natarajan, who is sitting over here this afternoon, and Gar Alparowitz. Now, one of the key messages that came out of last night's panel was the importance of continued political activity in the face of the huge forces for war and destruction that are still confronting us. And indeed, Dan's work did not end with the release of the Pentagon Papers. Far from it. For the past decades, Dan has been extremely active in writing, speaking, and fighting against war, against nuclear destruction, and for peace and for a better world. Today, we are extremely fortunate to hear about this work and Dan's views on these life and death issues. Dan's lecture is entitled The Dollar Auction, Unendable Wars, and Gambling with Catastrophe. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Ellsberg.
Thank you. Now, is this on? I'm not sure. Is this going? Can you hear me in back? Yes? Okay. Not going to start with life and death here. First of all, how many people here are economists? Okay. It just occurred to me, just sitting here, that this is the first time I have spoken to an audience of economists since, I think, for about 60 years. When I addressed the Econometric Society, somewhere with a talk on the Savage Axioms entitled "Winning at Russian Roulette." Got a lot of people come to hear that, but now this is an easier one. And I asked if you're economists because I'm going to start with a little to make some money here. As a matter of fact, something you'll all appreciate. How many people here have participated in the auction of $1? Or have, yes? Okay, you're out of the game, actually. Or have heard about it. How many have read about it? Okay, a couple, okay. You can stand back or participate, it doesn't really matter. It was invented by my friend Martin Shubik at Rand, an economist, game theorist, helped me with my honors thesis, actually, in 1952 on game theory, on rational choice under uncertainty, the contributions of von Neumann and Morgenstern. And Shubik had worked with Oscar Morgenstern in Princeton. I saw both Morgenstern and Shubik at the time. It just occurred to me one thing about Shubik, it's kind of related to this game and what I hope to get out of it. that he once told me that it was his ambition as an economist someday to have someone ask him. He was going to invest in himself and do some business. And he was waiting for the day when someone would say, "If you're so smart, why aren't you rich?" To which he could answer, "By God, I am rich." And I'm not sure whether he ever fully achieved this ambition. But he invented this game at Rand, and very simple. Actually, I asked for this because it was empty here and a minute ago, and I thought I would have to come back and talk to you. But I'm going to auction off a dollar bill. My own dollar here. We're going to bid for it, or you can bid for the dollar. And the winning bid gets the dollar. And we're limited to 5 or 10 cents at a time. Raise, that's all. Okay, I get to keep the proceeds because it's my dollar. There's one, to make it more interesting for me, also the second bid, the losing bid, the second highest bid, will also pay me. And we'll not get anything, but the winner will get the dollar. Who will start the bidding here? Yeah, what do you get?
25 cents.
No, you have to start at 5 or 10 cents. Only can start at 5 or 10 cents.
10 cents.
What? 10. Okay, 10 cents. Do I hear? Oh, is there anybody who can take this down? How about you? You've been through this. Just take down the bids so we'll know where we are. Okay, I saw another bid there. Didn't I see you?
All right, 20.
20 cents?
Yeah.
20 cents for the dollar. Dollar going for 20 cents? 25? 35. 35, right. You can go up 10. I used to say only 5 cents, but we're going big today. 35 cents for this dollar. What? 40, okay. 45. We're still at it? Okay.
50.
What? 50, okay. What do you got? 55. I'm glad to see that women are getting into this here. They're not always the first to raise their hands, but when there's a dollar at stake, that's very, very prudent. Okay, 50, I think, was the highest bid. 55, all right. 65, okay. 65, okay. 75, right? I have to do the arithmetic in my head. 10 cents, yes, right. Okay, 75, right. Going for 75, what? 85, 10 cents at a time. Okay, 85, going for 85 here. What? What? How are we doing? 90. Sorry, wait. 90? You said 90? Okay, dollar going for 90 cents. Get what? A dollar. Okay, a dollar going for a dollar and 90 cents to you, if I understand, and a dollar for you. Right? Any more bids? What? $1.10. Who said?
$1.10.
Okay. $1.10. Who is the dollar here? You're the dollar. You're the dollar. Okay, it's a dollar to you, $1.10 to him. Yes? No, he said $1.10 already. Sorry, you're outbid. What? $1.15. Okay, for a dollar. Where do we stand now? I don't know. $1.15. You're the high bidder. Who is the $1.10?
Right here.
What?
He's $1.10.
Okay, how are we doing? So, going for $1.15?
120.
What?
$1.20.
Why are you doing this? You're a relative of mine. Well, you're keeping it in the family here. Okay, $1.20 and you $1.15 to you. You $1.15, $1.20. No, that's 20 cents higher. Did I say no? What? Didn't you say what was the last one? 120. What's yours? He's 120. 125. Okay, right. Now we're going. 125. Is that it? Going for 125? What?
130.
I think you're cooperating here, but let's say, okay, 130, 125 to you, 130 to him. Going for 130, and you'll pay me 125. He will pay 130, and he gets $1, okay? 135. All right. How are we doing here? 135, going for 135. And let's see, you're the last one, right? So 130 to you, and he gets it for $1.35, correct?
I think I'll just stop there.
Okay. Okay, let's, to you, sir, got 35 cents? I'll get the change later, but no, I'll take the $1, though. $1, got 35? And let's see, that was $1.30 to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have any money.
No, you can pay later.
Playing a game.
Wait, you'll pay later, but by the way, you could bid. It's not too late to bid if you want.
We'll just leave it.
What?
We'll just leave it.
Okay, now, this is the first time, let's see, you don't have $1 on you?
Nope. I'm new school. I don't have any dollars. I don't have any paper.
Later, okay. Now, this is actually,
Thank you.
how many people have seen this before? Anybody? Nobody? You, so you.
I've seen this.
What happened when you saw it before?
Well, the students went way over $1 the first 2 times, and the third time they collaborated.
No,
to
you
make
can't,
two
yeah,
businesses.
but how far did they go?
Oh, $1.50, $1.75, something like that.
Yeah, okay. How many people here foresaw, most of you didn't bid? Thank you. That's from,
Bob is under.
oh, for him. You, okay. You owe it to him. Thank you. Okay. Plus 30 cents, I believe. If you, okay. How many people here foresaw, let me ask you, if I may, sir. Did you foresee that it would go up to $1?
Yes.
You did?
Me too.
And why did you, bid more than $1 then?
Well, because I thought it was your $1.
See, this was a motive that I did not anticipate, actually. You wanted to give me, what?
It was your $1, not mine.
Okay, let me say though, the point of this, it's actually been done hundreds to even thousands of times. And there's a whole book on it called Too Much Invested to Quit. And many articles on this. If you look up dollar auction, you'll see a lot of articles. Now, how many people here foresaw that this would go up to $1? Really? Okay. How many did not, frankly, truthfully? Okay. How many foresaw that it would go over $1? Well, I don't know about that. Okay, so you say, without having read it before, but I can tell you that, for example, one man at Wharton School, Pennsylvania, done this several hundred times. Actually, it has been done bidding for not $1 but $10, and sometimes a $100 bill in front of businessmen, and a number of times actually. That one once went to $13,000, which is the record. But the business school person you'll see who's written a story, I have back in my room 15 or 20 articles on this, said that having done it hundreds of times with his students, I think for $10 at a time, $1 bid at a time, that he had made $17,000. And I just made what? You do the arithmetic, I can't, standing up here. But essentially, no one, this came close to it, but in those times, no one had never stopped before $1. Remember, if it's over 50 cents, I make money because I get at least 60 cents plus 50 cents for the dollar, so I make 10 cents. But essentially, but if it goes to $1, I make $1. If it goes over $1, etc. Essentially, no one has ever stopped below $1. Now, it said most of you didn't bid because you could see that it would go up to $1. Very good. I think in post-examinations, it doesn't usually, that's not the result usually. Most people do not foresee. Let's put it to the bidders. The bidders, I won't ask them here now, but asking the bidders, people who bid at all, almost none of them foresee that they could pay more than $1 beforehand. In other words, it's a lack of foresight on this one, or imagine, how could they pay more than $1 for a dollar bill? And they don't foresee the incentives. Of course, there's a slight trick in the incentives here, that if you don't pay more than $1, you are going to lose more than if you had quit 5 or 10 times earlier. You will lose money. You'll lose more than you would have if you'd quit earlier. So you have a basis for regret there, or reproach or something. And you will lose more than the one who wins. And no matter how much you bid for $1, whether it's, and I think typically for $1, and this was low here, smart people, but it is done with economists all the time. PhDs, businessmen, all kinds of people. It's not just bumpkins. That it normally goes, an average is about $3. And so that is what, more than here. So that's what has to be explained. $1.50 is not actually, is not unusual, but the average is higher. And so the question is, how can this be? And what are the analogies in real life? Well, people have asked the people what the bidding was, what was in their minds and so forth. And usually it goes in 3 stages. First, they're bidding to win $1, for 5 cents. Why not? Why would you not bid 5 cents? One might say, by the way, you could say the rational move is not to bid at all. And if everybody follows that rational strategy, somebody passes up a chance to get $1 for 5 cents. Okay? So in each case, no matter what your expectations are, you can't say that bidding another 5 cents will not possibly gain you anything. Because in fact, first, it may gain you $1 or what is left under $1. But if it's over $1 and you've gotten over $1, and see what comes down to it, and it was a little peculiar here, and I have to say, I'm not necessarily good at doing this because it's the first time I've ever done it, actually. But I thought it would illustrate some things worthwhile. And it usually does, as I say, go considerably over that. So even if you're over the $1 and sure to lose money, the next 5 cents could get you the $1 if the other person stops as you stopped. You said, okay, there were 2 left here. By the way, it comes down to 2 eventually, see. You came into it later because you wanted to give me some money, apparently. But that's an unusual incentive. You said it was my $1 you wanted to do it. I should do it with strangers, I guess. So no matter when they come in, they have a chance to, at first, as I say, to win some money they didn't have. 95 cents, 50 cents, 10 cents, 5 cents, whatever. Then they hit $1. And to most bidders, this is surprising that they're still in the game. How did they get up to $1? They didn't imagine themselves bidding 90 cents for a $1 bill. But it could win. It could win. Nobody can say it's impossible. The other guy will get out at that point. If you bid $1, at most, you can come out even. So you might quit, except that you'd pay 90 cents. If you're over the $1, again, if you were the one to quit, as you did, but in a way maybe affected by the fact that you didn't have any money to start with, so you were doing this all on credit, apparently. Yeah, I don't know how that affects the calculation here, but if you quit at some point, there are several things about this. First of all, You're paying, let's say, $1.30 and you quit at that. The other person has bid $1.40. Said, I quit. Why didn't you quit one time before? Or 2 times before, or 3, or 4, or 5? Go down 10 times. You know, you could have quit and you'd lose less than you did. Second, if you quit then, you're a quitter. And now we get into the third phase. I say the first phase is they've discovered you're trying to win some money. Then you realize after $1, the 2 that are left, because normally no one else would get into the game at that point. They can only lose. So 2 people are left with an incentive to bid only. It virtually always goes that way. The person who quits, as I say, is facing several facts. One, they're losing money, so they look foolish that they've gotten into this thing at all. And there's an audience. That's how we started with an auction. Second, they have lost more than the other person. I'll come back to that, but the other person gets $1. And they get what they bid, less than $1. $1, they have to pay more. And third, in the second phase, they are trying to reduce their losses. See, if I've gotten up to $1.10, and I stop there, I pay $1, I lose 10 cents. No, you lose $1.10. Somebody else has bet $1.20. But not only that, but you have shown that you're the quitter, unlike the other person. And what gets people up to $13,000 if they're businessmen, or $3 or $4 if we're betting 5 cents at a time, is the notion, I'm not going to let this other guy beat me. I am not going to be the quitter. I'm not going to lose more than he does. The other person who's been bidding has been bidding, it turns out, to be sure that the other person doesn't lose less than he does. You're imposing it on him, and so forth. What this shows, by the way, you can say this is irrational behavior. At each point, the person is making a decision, a choice. Nobody's compelling them. They're not doing anything other than they promised to do earlier. Did you find this in the beginning? And the notion, as I say, the third phase of not being a loser, not being a relative loser, not losing more than the other person, and finally somebody quits, as you said. Why did you quit, actually, at that point? You weren't paying anything? You didn't have any money anyway.
I don't know. I think my ego was showing because I wanted to, okay, yeah. So anyway, I think my ego was showing because what I was trying to do was, outbid, but then have him pay more for $1. I don't know.
But then why did you quit then? Why not keep going?
I don't know why I did not. I just felt like, all right, I'm just gonna stop there and just say, all right, let him pay off.
Okay,
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that is what keeps this thing going. That is the typical thinking. And why does somebody quit in the end after $3 or $10 or $100, bidding for $10? Is you say, the other person isn't going to quit before I am, after all. It's not impossible. They might have quit the next time. And one other thing I didn't mention, the person who, quote, wins and gets the $1 is justified in their, say it goes 10 cents at a time, is justified at their last 10 bids. Because if they had quit earlier than that, they would have lost the $1. You can work it out in your mind. But if you get the $1, the other person drops out here, you get the $1 and you have to pay more than $1. But had you stopped 10 cents earlier, you wouldn't get the $1, or twice before, or 3 times, before that. So you've been justified in what you've been doing lately, in the eyes of everybody looking here. You don't look like a fool for the last 5 or 10 bids, because in the end, it paid off. They justified themselves, 10 cents at a time. Okay? Well, I'm just saying now, that is a particular instance where nobody gets hurt. And actually, even with the businessman, nobody goes bankrupt. So they lose $3 looking perhaps foolish. Why did I do that? Why was I in this game? Why did I keep bidding? But, you know, life is not over. They lost $3. Or a businessman has lost $12,990. You know, all right, pocket change, you know, for these people. The problem is that the same phenomenon appears where lives are at stake. Notice that in the dollar auction, not only is life not at stake, but nobody else's money is at stake even. Nobody else loses. Only 2 people pay in the end, and not that much. But the other people who've bid, and there's no collateral damage here in effect. It's not imposing a open-ended damage, let's say, to the environment or to anybody else at all. But come into a situation now where lives are at stake, such as the catastrophe I was involved in Vietnam, which did in fact precede 40,000 by 50,000 by 50,000 by 50,000 increments. I was involved from the beginning in that. From August of 1964, by coincidence, the Tonkin Gulf episode that very day, but no troops went in at that point. Bombing started. The first bombing of us by another country since the Korean War. This is 64. Korean War ended a decade before that. So now we were bombing 80 sorties over North Vietnam, the beginning of bombing in North Vietnam. Actually, my boss and myself, my boss was a Harvard law professor named John McNaughton, now an assistant secretary of defense. I was his assistant, working mainly on Vietnam. Neither of us thought that the bombing would do any good, that it would not cause the other side to quit. It would only kill a lot of people, escalate the problem, and would kill to no purpose. We were both against starting any bombing, although this supposedly was a response to an attack on us. So naturally, you know, we've got to bomb back here. They'd attacked our destroyers, first attack since the Second World War, actually. It didn't occur in Korea. So first attack on our destroyers. It hadn't actually happened, and we knew that either that night or 2 days later before Congress voted an open-ended escalation of the war to LBJ, thinking, because he told them this to Fulbright, this was not an open-ended. He would not do anything more without coming back to Congress. He promised them that. This was just to show support for what he had already done, to show that he had done it with the post-approval of Congress, even though they hadn't given. But it was, the Constitution does allow, actually, without act of Congress, response to a sudden attack on our forces. That was constitutional. That was. But Senator Morse, who voted against the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which is almost identical to the authorization for the use of military force in Afghanistan, which is still in effect, and presidents are still drawing on it. In fact, I am certain that if pressed for the constitutional basis for having just sent tanks 2 days ago to Syria, Trump would appeal to that bill of 2001, or the next one in 2002. It was an open-ended declaration of war by Congress, and Morse pointed out that that was unconstitutional. That the Congress said, the Constitution said, Article 2, Section 8, if it's a war, not just 80 sorties responding to an attack on our destroyers, but if it's a war, and of course, Trump would say, you know, tanks to Syria, that's not a war. You know. Obama said, sending planes over Libya and drones is not a war, so I don't have to appeal to the War Powers Act or Article 2, Section 8. It's not a war. Really? Why not? Killing people? Because American troops are not in danger. The Libyans didn't have enough anti-aircraft to endanger them. We didn't lose any forces. So the legal counsel to President Obama, former legal dean, I believe, of the law school at Duke, I think it was, who had denounced Bush for the Iraq clear-cut aggression, clear-cut crime against the peace, clear-cut violation of Article Section 8, had started an aggressive war against Iraq. And this guy had actually denounced that as a law professor, said absolutely illegal. And now as counselor to Obama inside the administration, he said, no problem, it's not a war. Our troops are not in danger. And an absurd proposition, one of the biggest turnarounds I can ever imagine. And this is from a very liberal, supposedly progressive guy. Okay, so that stopped. We then went into the election with the president promising no wider war. We in the Pentagon, and I had joined that day of August 4th, knew that was a lie. They were planning night and day a wider war, and specifically, in particular, with renewed bombing after the election. So when that started, and it was on election day, I knew that the public was being lied into a war against Senator Goldwater, who was calling for a wider war, and the president was saying, we seek no wider war. And on that day, neither I nor anybody else over at the State Department, an interagency meeting, had time to vote in 1964 because we were busy deciding how to conduct the bombing campaign against North Vietnam, how to make a wider war. Couldn't do that the day before because it might have leaked to the election, to the voters, and revealed to them not that they had a choice of no war, but that they didn't have a choice between war and bigger war. I mean, that was their choice, I'm sorry, not with no war. So we didn't want that to leak, and it couldn't wait till the next day because it wasn't clear that the puppet government we were holding up in Saigon could last more than days or a week unless we got into there with an escalation. So I participated in a total hoax on the government here, on the fraud, in November of 1964. But what I was really coming to was, then we came to the point of starting the bombing. And as I say, my boss, who worked for McNamara, and I worked for him, the two of us thought, terrible idea, we should not be doing this. The Tonkin Gulf, a one-off thing, and tit for tat, no tit, just tat. But anyway, the public doesn't know that, so let's not do any more. But McNamara wanted it for reasons we didn't know. And I used to ask my boss, why is he doing this? Why does he want to do this? The president, by the way, was saying in front of McNaughton, who was very pleased to be in the meeting in the Oval Office, to McNamara, you're bombing bullshit, which he didn't want to do, which made him sound quite good to me. LBJ, but he has feet on the ground here. But why does our boss, McNamara, who I revered because of his opposition to nuclear weapons, in many ways, why did he want to do it? And McNaughton said, McNamara says, it's something you can stop. It's a bargaining chip. You bomb, and then you can stop bombing. Easier, he was actually using it to oppose the Joint Chiefs' recommendations to get ground troops in. Because McNamara thought, ground troops you can't take out. Once they've taken casualties, they've gotten shot, you can't get them out. So I don't want to put ground troops in. I'll give the JCS bombing, which is what they wanted. And that, in negotiations, I could stop. And we did stop 8 years later. After nearly almost 7.8 million tons of bombs, compared to 2 million, or I saw yesterday for the first time, I looked it up, 2.6, I think that includes Allied bombing, million tons of bombs in World War II. So this is nearly 4 times the tonnage of bombs of World War II on Indochina, which had, by the way, been bombed in World War II, among other places. And that includes the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. So what the hell here was going on? One other thing was very striking to me. There were people who thought the bombing had promise, the Air Force primarily, not the Army or the Navy. but they went along so that the Army could get the ground troops and the Navy could get the battleships offshore and their bombs over. The Army did not believe bombing of North Vietnam would do any good, but they lied to the president and said, we all agree bombing is necessary. The Army did not think bombing would do any good. They lied because they wanted the ground troops in. Okay, 1938, February 1938. I've been in Vietnam for 2 years. I've come back with hepatitis. Talking to my friend Mort Halpern in the White House, who was then working for, I guess it was still McGeorge, no, who was it then? Walt Rostow, yeah. And in the NS, Mort Halpern was still in the Pentagon. Later, he worked for Kissinger in the Nixon administration. He happened to mention to me, this was after McNamara had just left in February. He had dropped a little over 2 million tons, won World War II. So Halpern said to me, you know, there are 3 people in this town who believe in what we're doing. 3, he said, Johnson, Rusk, and Walt Rostow. We thought, that could be, sounds a little off the roof, a little extreme here. Let's think a while. Couldn't think of anybody else who believed in it. I was in a group of 36 people who were writing the Pentagon Papers at that time, McNamara's study of decision-making in Vietnam. McNamara had just left. A number of the people in our group were hawks. One of them worked for Reagan on the big Contra War, later in charge in Central America. Most of them were Republicans and hawks. They'd all been in Vietnam. That was a criterion for being in the group, which is why I was in it, the McNamara. None of them believed, all thought we should be getting out of Vietnam. They'd been there. And that was true of nearly everyone. Now, that didn't mean that the 3 million people who'd eventually been to Vietnam believed that we couldn't win the war, that we shouldn't win the war. But nobody believed that the bombing we were doing was worth doing. Some people in the Air Force still said, if we really go all the way, we hit all the targets, we mine, we do all this stuff, that'll make a difference. But not what we're doing, which was keeping a lid on it. McNamara was keeping a lid on it, but a lid that had resulted by this time in about, I think, almost 2.5 million tons of bombs at that point. So I thought, okay, interesting. That seems about right, that nobody believes in this. March 68. The bombing went on for 5 years, and most of it lay ahead. Nixon, we dropped another 1 million tons of bombs, half of World War II, in 1968, the year of the Tet Offensive. McNamara had left. That was under Clifford, who wanted us out of Vietnam. Under Nixon and Kissinger, 4.5 million tons of bombs. 2 World War IIs and Korea as well. Lay ahead by people who at no point carrying this out or deciding and whatnot believed that what they were doing was doing any good. The hawks believed we're hitting the wrong targets, we're not doing enough, we're not going up to the Chinese border. The other said, this is not accomplishing anything, it's not affecting the war in South Vietnam, and yet it kept going. So that is something that I have been pondering ever since. And I think I have some answers by this time, which I won't go into in detail. I'll talk a little more about this tomorrow, actually, in the meeting. I hope a lot of you will actually come to that, because these 2 lectures are really a unit. I really get to the heart of the matter, I think, a little more. I thought I would start out with a little demonstration here. But the relevance to the dollar auction is this. How could we have been putting 100,000, another 100,000, another 100,000, up to 500,000 in Vietnam, and the bombing going on month after month after month for years? I think the total, I could be wrong on this, was something like a Hiroshima a week for 7 years in tonnage. Well, could be. It was thought for years to be, to people who hadn't been inside, hadn't read the Pentagon Papers, the thesis of David Halberstam, The Making of a Quagmire, and later, what was it called, The Best and the Brightest. whose thesis was, before he read the Pentagon Papers when they came out, he had to delay his book for a year and try to revise it as much as he could. But the thesis, which is refuted by the Pentagon Papers, was the military, the Joint Chiefs, were telling the president, both Kennedy and Johnson, these were the best and the brightest, but the military were saying, one more step will win. One more step. And the president, second point, the president might not have believed that, but felt under pressure. Well, the second thesis is the president believed that. He wasn't thinking much about it. He was looking at other problems like Berlin and the Soviet Union and everything else was not directly in the war. He wasn't paying attention to Vietnam. He was just going along with the military in the belief that the next step would win. That was the prevailing attitude, even among relatively anti-war critics like Halberstam and others, Dick Goodwin and others. It was never true at 1 month in the war. It was always wrong. And the Pentagon Papers demonstrated that very clearly. And I knew, and now we connect to the second part of my title here, Gambling with Catastrophe. In the dollar auction, you're not dealing with the prospect of catastrophe. It may be a surprise that you pay 10 times more than the dollar is worth, or 100 times more, but that's not a catastrophe, and I say it doesn't involve other people. But the Vietnam War was predicted to lead toward catastrophe, and not just by doves, in turn, but by people who had, in effect, were the architects of the Cold War. There's no one who more deserves that title than Clark Clifford. I won't explain why exactly, but as a counselor to Harry Truman in 1948, he had urged him to run against his threat to the left, from the left, Henry Wallace, by anti-communism. Go anti-communist, tire Wallace as a communist, supported by communists and so forth. The fight with, and then Paul Nitze, another architect, had much the same problem, but Clifford was, as I say, a Cold Warrior through and through. I was a small junior Cold Warrior, following the same theory. Clifford told Johnson in July of 1965, when I was in the Pentagon, actually I think this, yes, it was early July, I see nothing ahead but catastrophe for my country. We had at that point 75,000 troops in Vietnam, as well as the bombing that had been going on since February. But the issue at that time was whether to add another 100,000, Westmoreland was asking for, with the understanding that there would be another 100,000 after them, so there'd be at least 300,000. And the head of the Army, Harold Johnson, no relation to Lyndon Johnson, had told Johnson at the beginning of the year, it will take 500,000 troops and 5 years. Now, I'm not quite sure where they got that calculation, but that was what they said. And the head of the Marine Corps, which I'd been in 54 to 57, but head of the Marine Corps said to him the same. 5 years, 500,000 men, with the first real big installment being the next 100,000. The real reason that was so big was that in theory, the first 75,000 were just guarding bases for the bombing. They weren't engaging in the fight. They weren't taking the fight over. They weren't going to suffer a large casualties. This was false, but this was the story. So you could get them out of there without, and they hadn't suffered many casualties. Get them out. But another 100,000? No. It's going to be hard. So Clifford said, the Russians and China do not intend for us to win this war. They will continue to support the North Vietnamese and the NLF to a degree that will prevent us from winning. We will get in deeper and deeper. The number 2 man in the ball, George Ball in the State Department, said exactly the same and had been saying it for a year. Exactly, he said, again, the 2 of them, and Hubert Humphrey, vice president, used the word catastrophe. Now, I'm meaning 500,000 troops. As Clifford put it, in July of 65, when we had 75,000 troops there, he said to the president in front of McNamara and Jack Valenti was taking notes. 500,000 men, 50,000 dead, that is not for us. But it was for us. 3 years later, we were not winning, but we had 550,000 men in Vietnam, and we eventually suffered 58,000 dead. An amazingly prescient figure, but it could have gone on a lot longer. Okay, so the president had been getting this advice at the highest levels now, from the vice president, who could count Democratic votes as well as anybody, as well as Lyndon, from George Ball, and from Clark Clifford, who he relied on very much, and who was later Secretary of Defense. Catastrophe lies ahead on a kind of quicksand, not all at once, not this year. Humphrey told him in '68, you will have trouble getting nominated in your party. There will be opposition in the Democratic Party, and you might well not be nominated. If you're nominated, you might well not win. He's talking votes here now, not just lives at that, which Clifford mentioned. And that could not be dismissed by Lyndon Johnson. Hubert Humphrey, another architect of the Cold War, by the way, but a liberal, definitely a liberal, had to be taken quite seriously. How could the president have gone ahead in the face of that advice, which, by the way, was concealed from me not only at the time, and I had everything else that turned up in the Pentagon Papers, but the Pentagon Papers never got these papers. They had been held so closely that the Pentagon Papers archives, they didn't come out for another 20 years. And what they were all were the warnings in detail, including from McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Assistant, and others, that McNamara's going along with the Joint Chiefs to send another 100,000 was reckless to the point of folly. I never saw language like that. There isn't any. In the 7,000 pages of the Pentagon Papers, you will not see catastrophe, folly. That's not bureaucratic language when you're arguing with your peers and so forth. So how could he do it? Well, as I say, it could be because he was getting the advice from the Joint Chiefs, but as I've just told you, that was the opposite of the truth. They were telling him, they weren't lowballing it. They were foolish to believe that 500,000 would do it, but actually they didn't say it would. Harold Wheeler, the head of the Joint Chiefs, said, it may take 1 million, all right? Which Westmoreland was asking for roughly in 1968. Those were my first leaks in 1968 to put out that he was asking for another 200,000. So he wasn't being told that. What then did he believe? Maybe he thought they were all wrong. Just yesterday, Chris Appy, my friend here, who spoke to his class the other day, handed me, at my request, his book. Let's see if I can find it here. I'm sorry. Oh, rats, I should have looked it up. Okay, there was what I thought was I just happened to open it up, and what I thought was quite an incredible quote. Well, I'll paraphrase. Having sent my wife back to get out of the room, the book, I'll not take the time to get the exact quote, but I will give it to you very closely. In early '64, Johnson was saying to McGeorge Bundy, and I had never seen this quote, that's why I wanted the book. This is a new one that just came out. Ellsberg reveal. God, I'm sorry. It's such a good quote that I hate to miss it, but okay. What he was saying was, in a telephone call that didn't come out till late, I don't see any way to win this war. We can't win. I don't see any way in, and we can't get out. We can't get out. Now, the leadership in the Senate wanted him desperately to get out, actually, at that point. But we can't get out. As one of his Texas friends said to him, Lyndon, Texans will excuse a fellow Texan almost anything, but not losing a war. And the idea of being a loser, a quitter, as was something that was even more fearsome to Lyndon Johnson than actually losing an election while trying hard to win. That's what Humphrey told him he would be facing. And remember, in '68, some of you will remember, he couldn't run because Robert Kennedy was running against him, and he was going to beat him in primaries, and he couldn't stand the thought of being beaten in primaries by his nemesis, Robert Kennedy, whom he hated. And he got out. He didn't run. There's more to that story. But Humphrey's prediction held up. But as he said to Doris Kearns, one of his biographers, in effect, Lyndon Johnson, he said he had a recurrent nightmare that he was in a pit, in a field, and people were running at him, led by Bobby Kennedy, saying, which might have happened in '65, saying, quitter, loser, weakling, says, unmanly man. Here was this monster of a man, Lyndon Johnson. Moreover, people pressed his face into theirs, their space and whatnot, but afraid of being regarded an unmanly man. It's true that his mother had dressed him in dresses till he was about 6 and with long curls, which was not unusual in that day. But anyway, he was very worried about his manlyhood, and he used to flaunt it in a number of different ways. And so I think psychologically there was that. But he wasn't the only one who would do that. I finally reached the notion that, studying the papers, trying to understand this, that year after year, presidents had been swayed by the notion, this is not the year to lose South Vietnam to communism, to get out, to quit, to cut the losses at any point. And the more troops invested, the stronger that became. And that was true of Nixon as well, as it went on years after him, and could have gone on years longer. And a catastrophe, of course, a moral catastrophe for this country did occur. We lost 58,000 men, but we killed up to 3 to 4 million. And essentially with the approval, acceptance, reluctant acceptance, of most of the Congress, including his party, who would have followed him out at any point, but no leader was willing to do that. Okay, do I have any more time? Because I need it. How long? 10 minutes? Yeah, let me take 10 minutes, okay. Get some water, one moment. Honey, you can't find it, I suppose. But take a look in the index and see if you can see Lyndon Johnson and McGeorge Bundy.
Okay.
I hate to lose that quote because it's so amazing in the beginning of '64, meaning that he had seen what the Dove critics inside and out had seen from the beginning, but could not bring himself to be a loser or a quitter. And by the way, there is a factor that nobody analyzing the dollar auction, I think, has looked at significantly. And that is that these people are not making, when it comes to being a loser or quitter, that's not just in their own minds. The identity has been molded by habits and instructions and tendencies over years because being a loser is socially costly. In a hierarchy, in a bureaucracy, you lose to your rivals. Somebody else says, wrongly, but plausibly, he didn't have to quit. The other people were on the verge. That was what, by the way, Walt Rostow was saying all the time. Look what Lincoln thought in '63 and '64, but he hung in there, and he won. 600,000 dead, he won. That was a very constant refrain by Johnson. They may be on the verge of quitting, which was never true, even slightly. But, he went on that. The catastrophe, they say, was not nuclear, although it turns out that nuclear weapons were being considered at various points in this process, and in particular by Richard Nixon. In fact, I'll just say very quickly, Richard Nixon was out of office because of crimes he took against me, my former psychoanalyst office, trying to kill me at one point, to keep me from revealing what I might have had, which was documentation of his nuclear threats against North Vietnam. or in fact, how many people saw the movie last night? Anybody here? Yeah, well, it may have gone too quickly, but you heard the little dialogue where Nixon is saying, how many did we kill in Laos? And Kissinger says, oh, 200,000. Nixon says, no, I'd rather use the nuclear bomb. Got that, Henry? And Henry says, oh, I think that would be just too much. And Nixon says, nuclear bomb, that's too big for you? I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake. That was in, you saw that, in 1972, in the election year of 1972. Going to that. So it was a nuclear crisis, after all. Could have gone nuclear, very much so. That got me interested in the study of catastrophes. And so in the remaining 8 minutes here, I'll just mention, I've made for decades now a study of catastrophes. And what I mean by that, some of them will come to you quickly. Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, the Challenger explosion. How many people remember that? Challenger explosion blowing up in front of our eyes with a school teacher aboard, Christy McAuliffe, aboard on that. Vietnam itself, of course. And in every 9/11, in every case I found, the word went out, no one could have foreseen this. It was unforeseeable, it was unexpected, an aberration, nothing certain, nobody's perfect. Nobody advised us, nobody warned us. That's what Condoleezza Rice said about 9/11. Sibel Edmonds said, nobody told us there was a possibility of Al-Qaeda people flying into the world towers, into towers, high buildings. And Sibel Edmonds from the FBI, a translator who had read the transcripts, said, that is a complete lie on television. And it was. And so Condoleezza backed off and said, nobody told me that it was, which was 99.9% certainty to be a lie, but there was no documentary evidence of it, that she had specifically read that cable. Hard to prove. So what's involved here, I found in every case was of a catastrophe, reasonably defined, as I've said here, a social catastrophe. There had been warnings from inside by authoritative people, not just outsiders or fringe people or a rumor or something, but people with high expertise. And not only warnings, but in many cases describing this outcome as likely or almost certain. As a matter of fact, George Ball in 1966, who wanted to cut off, was saying what would happen in 68, pretty much what Humphrey had said. And by the way, I've talked to the aides of both Ball and Humphrey and learned from them they did not know of each other's memos, which the president had ordered them to keep secret, show nobody that I have gotten advice like this against what I'm doing. And as I say, it wasn't in the Pentagon Papers. So Ball said, this is what's going to happen. And he found himself, to his surprise, pressed by Johnson to say, can you prove that, Ball and George? And Ball would say, I couldn't understand why the burden of proof was being put on me. Usually he would say, if it's possible, or even likely, you shouldn't do this. Instead, I was being ordered to prove what is not possible to prove. It will certainly result, Seemed crazy. Well, as I said, that turned out to be the case in every catastrophe I could look at. And let me bring it right up to the present, like yesterday. Yesterday, we find that Boeing had deliberately lobbied to reduce the regulation on the safety regulations of the 737 MAX, which went down twice. But what else turned out? Their top test pilot had called it more than a year earlier, egregious dangers on this. By the way, I assumed this would turn out to be the case. It was true in everything I looked at, that when something turned out like this, the experts had not failed to say, this is what's going to happen. And if you look up the Boeing 737, you'll see every day there's some new stuff on that of how much Boeing knew. Now, again, the question arises, how could they go ahead? In the Challenger, I'll just mention this happens to be a very dramatic one, the Challenger that exploded. It was the very Challenger itself had been postponed, the launch, about 3 times earlier. The launches were postponed much more often than they went on time. Usually, all it took was for one agency to say, don't do this, there's a danger here, we have to look into it. This was the single time when Thiokol, the makers of the solid fuel, had said, the experts had said, don't do this, there's too great a danger of it exploding from the O-rings because it was the coldest, it was colder than they had ever tried to launch and below the safety limit they'd allowed, and they knew the O-rings could burn, and they had done so when it was cold. It was the one time they made that reservation and the one time that management overruled them and went ahead. And I believe that one of the engineers eventually committed suicide. Others, under great censure and being forced out of the thing, I was just reading, written books about it, how their career was over for having called it right on that thing with the Challenger blowing up. Now, why overload? Well, in every case, what I found was that having heard these warnings, that the leaders in corporations or the president or the things had deliberately gambled with the possibility that they knew of catastrophe. Not zero, and in some cases, rather high. Something that would never have been agreed to by people who weren't in that position of being the president. How could they do it? And I've come to the end here. I could start at this point, but I'll just tell you my outcome. In each case, they were facing a short-term loss that was almost certain. There was a certainty premium on this, as Kahneman and Tversky call it, in their prospect theory, which is a very good theory of decision-making under uncertainty, better than the alternatives. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, well known, and Michael Lewis wrote a book about their collaboration and so forth. And they pointed out that in regular decision-making, the certainty of a loss looms very, very high in people's decision-making. They did this from experiments and then from real-life large experiments. And I put a number of their thoughts together that aren't actually together in their work, and I would sum it up like this. Faced with the almost certainty of a short-term loss that will be a personal loss for the decision-maker or the agency making it, where the alternative is something that might come out even. You'd avoid the loss. You won't look like a loser or quitter, whatnot. You'll have some kind of a win eventually, combined with a real risk of disaster. They will take the gamble secretly if they can keep it secret, and presidents can, and corporation leaders can keep it secret, because people will not risk their jobs to put out the word even when lives are at stake. And remember, Clifford, Ball, McNamara, and all the others knew hundreds of thousands of lives were at stake. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, McNamara believed on Saturday night, October 27th, that he would not see another Saturday. Or other times he put it, I would not see another sunset. It was a sunset that Saturday night. It was a Saturday night. Meaning, he thought there was a real possibility he wouldn't die alone. Everybody would die. And he did not say to the president, back off. Don't do this. The Thiokol people, the ones who advised, not the ones who overruled them, who never regretted openly what they did, regretted to the end of their lives that they had not done more to stop this problem, that they had gone along with the management saying for the first time ever, we overruled the experts, the engineers. They hadn't stopped it. And no one stopped Iraq. Everyone saw a disaster ahead in Iraq, in the government. There was not one general who thought that attacking Iraq was a good idea, except retired generals who were consulting with George W. Bush. Not one brigadier, major, lieutenant general thought that we should attack Iraq. I doubt if there is anyone lower than John Bolton who believes that we should attack Iran. But if that happens, this month, whistleblowing is getting a better press than it ever has in my lifetime. So I'll say something different from what I would have said a month ago. It's possible that somebody will talk, actually. The Mattis resigned because he didn't get out of Syria, before. But he didn't tell why. He kept his mouth shut about it and let the policy go on. That is a typical thing. A rule, I'll end with this. It's a very grim rule, but it's what we have to deal with. Did you find the quote? Good work. Honey. Look, okay, this is good. I'm glad. Thank you. How'd you find it?
The index.
Okay. Here's what he said on May 27th, 1964 to Bundy, and I have never read this before yesterday. I came in August of 64, Tonkin Gulf. Here's May. I won't imitate Lyndon Johnson needlessly. Looks to me that we're getting into another Korea. It just worries the hell out of me. I don't see what we can ever hope to get out of there with once we're committed. I don't think we can fight them 10,000 miles away from home and ever get anywhere. And that 10,000, Trump has been saying, why are we fighting 7,000 miles in Syria? But then 2 days later, he's sending tanks to Syria. I don't think it's worth fighting for, and I don't think we can get out, and it's just the biggest damn mess that I ever saw. What in hell? Remember, the top senators are telling him to get out. Humphrey is telling him to get out. Others, Ball is telling him to get out. Clifford can't do it. It's just the biggest damn mess. What in hell am I ordering those kids out there for? What the hell is Vietnam worth to me? What is it worth to this country? It's damned easy to get in a war, but it's going to be awfully hard to ever extricate yourself if you get in. That was the president in May of 64. In August of 64, 80 sorties against North Vietnam to respond to an attack that hadn't happened, as he knew, within a day or two. 8 million tons more by 1973. 550,000 men, 3 to 4 million dead, according to McNamara. Do you ask for more prescience, more knowledge, more warning in a president? Is reflection and rationality and good decision-making the answer? I can tell you I was in every day of that decision-making for the next year. There has never been a decision in the history of this country that has gotten more institutional analysis and reflection and calculation than the bombing of North Vietnam. Never. And that's where it started. So as someone who worked on rational decision-making under uncertainty for my honors thesis and risk, ambiguity, and decision for my PhD thesis, rationality was my religion. Rational decision-making. It starts out, the first line of my honors thesis, I can say from memory, to be rational is to make decisions in the light of their consequences. It's pretty close. But what if their consequences are uncertain? It is necessary to be reasonable, is what I said, is to make decisions in light of their consequences. You just heard the consequences there, in the light of the president. What if the consequences are uncertain? One should still, no doubt, be reasonable, but the question is what that may mean. And then I wrote a thesis on that. I went to RAND because it was the Vatican of decision theory and of rationality, of utilitarianism, essentially. What's better and what's worse? What's optimal under the conditions and whatnot? Those people, the best and the brightest, but even more the military. If we'd done what the military had done, even worse. But they had calculated too. Just as much. Calculation did nothing for us. Intelligence did nothing for us. Do we need more intelligent people than Robert McNamara or Henry Kissinger, let's say, or some others? And I'm not joking here. By the way, John Bolton is not a stupid person. The question of the premises of rationality, what your aims are, what your expectations are. And notice here the expectations can be very realistic. But if losing is intolerable, then the values you put, the utilities you put on those outcomes are basically twofold, two-valued, 0 and 1. There is losing and there is not losing. And that gives you dominant strategies. I'm talking decision theory here, in a very simple-minded way. But it makes it simple to things. Don't lose under any circumstances. And it comes down to this. I conclude that the people in power regard their own loss of office or status or esteem, or their own blame for something, as essentially equivalent to catastrophe. If I lose office, catastrophe. Like blowing up the world. Or that wasn't at stake in Vietnam, killing a lot of other people over there, 10,000 miles away. How about 58,000? And so forth. As Mort Halpern said to me later, I said to him once, and he'd worked for Nixon at the beginning of the year, I said, what if they had foreseen what it would mean to drop another 4 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, and the next 20,000 American names on the monument, which Nixon put in. He went down as having gotten us out of Vietnam with honor in 1973. He didn't lose. Halpern said, oh, they would have done it, absolutely. They would have regarded that as worthwhile. Or as Madeleine Albright said, when confronted with the fact that we might have starved 500,000 Iraqi children from the sanctions in the 90s, and she said, worth it, actually, worthwhile, reluctantly, okay. So I'll close by saying I came up with 3 principles, and I'm going to talk about one tomorrow in particular. I say gambling with catastrophe, but a very specific case. The ethics of threatening omnicide, which America has done for about 60 years. Not from the very beginning of nuclear era, but since about 1950, our plans have been premised on, not on omnicide, on multigenocide, which would in fact have killed nearly everybody without at that time foreseeing it. Nobody's perfect, you can't foresee everything, but possibly doing that. So I'll talk about that tomorrow. But the results I come with here are these. Economists almost entirely ignore the factor of sunk costs, the significance of sunk costs, by saying they should be ignored. Bygones are bygones. The question is what to do next. Like somebody in the dollar auction who says, okay, I'm into this for $3, but should I bid another 10 cents? That's the issue. Forget the other, that's gone. You're going to lose it in any case. It turns out that's not a good theory for economic theory. It's not the way people act. And to sum up what I learned from Kahneman Tversky about the willingness to gamble with the possibility of catastrophe in order to avoid a sure short-term loss. I didn't tell you what the problem was in the Challenger. The president wanted to communicate with Christy McAuliffe in his State of the Union message from space. He had a space phone call scheduled for his State of the Union message. First time, first civilian in space, first teacher in space. Every school child in America was listening in, and he was going to talk to her, and the window was closing for allowing that communication to be made. The satellite would be the Challenger would be out of range otherwise, and if they disappointed the president on this, NASA could lose its budget that year for further space exploration. So that night, having postponed it several times before, it had to go, because otherwise their budget was in danger, and on the other side, Christy McAuliffe was in danger and she died. Okay, well, time after time, that's the way it worked. So what I concluded was 3 things. Men in power are willing to, 3 things, are willing to massacre, I'll talk about this tomorrow, not tonight, much more than anyone imagines as an instrument of power, to risk it and to do it, as we did in World War II, in Vietnam, and Korea, and whatnot. They don't have the inhibitions against doing that we imagine. 2, they can decide to risk doing that rather than take what to other people looked like a small loss. They're losing office, or they're losing the Great Society budgeting for 1965, which was destroyed within 2 years by Vietnam. But rather than lose the budget in 65, let's send the next 100,000 and go on from there. They will risk that. They will risk that catastrophe. They will risk the world, as McNamara and Kennedy did in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and again, and as Andropov did in 1983 for the Russians. And finally, they will get obeyed, and their silence will be kept, their secrets will be kept by any number of people, subordinates, who believe that this is a catastrophic course of action. Terrible, can't work. Heard last night, Patricia and I, testimony of Vind, is that his name, Vind, yesterday, who complained twice that the president was committing a crime on that telephone call, which the lieutenant colonel had listened in on. He complained it, he told Ambassador Sondland, this is a crime, you can't do this. But he didn't tell Congress, and he didn't tell the public till now. That's typical. It's not just typical, it's almost universal. That has to change, because the life of this species and every other large species on Earth depends on changing that behavior.
For some questions? Yes. Should I take that?
First, I want to say thank you for what you did back then. I was around to remember. I want to know, what was your epiphany moment? When did you decide, and why, that you could not... I want to know what caused your epiphany, the moment when you said, I can no longer support this, I'm going to do something.
That's interesting, because I don't remember. I wrote the word epiphany in my yellow pad today. What epiphanies? Who was the guy who asked me? Where are you? There. In my pad, I made a list of epiphanies this afternoon. It so happened. I don't remember having done that before. I even thought, good word. Why haven't I ever thought of this before? And I could mention a number, but when you mention Vietnam, I think virtually everybody in Vietnam that I know of thought that what we were doing had no promise, whatever. Many of them thought if we do it differently, if we do it more, if we do it more cleverly, we can make some progress. I even believed that for a while. I definitely came to understand that we weren't going to change, so that was irrelevant. So when I talk nearly everyone, I'm talking 3 million people. I don't know how many people who were there 6 months, and I was there 2 years, who believed that what we were doing had any prospect of success of any kind. But they did their job, like me. I came back determined to get us out, because this shouldn't go on. I knew this. Now I was back with hepatitis, so I couldn't go in the field. And I thought, okay, better, I'll go back to Washington. And I spoke to Walt Rostow and to Robert McNamara and to Averell Harriman, a number of other people at highest levels, saying that they should get out, which McNamara agreed with me, by the way, and had for 2 years, it turns out. What the president said in '64, you just heard, McNamara believed in '63. It never really changed. So that was not his mistake. When Halberstam said McNamara was, in short, a fool, though he looked very smart, actually not in that way that Halberstam thought. He could see the reality as well as anybody at that point, but he went along with the president. So two things. I won't go into the whole thing, and I say it in a book called Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam in the Pentagon Papers. So it's almost devoted to that subject of how I came to a change. But two things. I read the earliest part of the Pentagon Papers, the last thing I read. I had them all in my authorized possession. And I put aside the 45 to 54 part because, like all the other Americans, I thought that's the French war that doesn't affect us very much. That's what we thought in Vietnam. The French were, after all, colonialist, imperialist, and even worse, racist. So they didn't have a chance, unlike us. And they didn't have, okay? So we paid no attention to what the French experienced. We didn't translate any of the French books on the war. I had to work to get one translated by Lacouture and Devier. Okay, so I read the first part and I realized that we had understood from the beginning that this was a French colonial reconquest of Vietnam that had declared its independence in July of 1945. And we were supporting it to regain its colony for various reasons, largely to get the French to allow us to rearm Germany. But that's a whole other story. And the Cold War, in short, which did not look to me like a good justification for carrying on war for 30 years, which is what happened. And so what I saw was then, everybody who's dying in Vietnam on both sides is dying as a result of US policy. We were supporting the war, the French 80% of their budget, keeping them in there when they wanted to get out, actually, in 51, 52. And for us, basically, because we didn't want to lose Vietnam to communism and so forth. So for our purposes, we kept that war going, and there would never have been a war after 54 when the French pulled out. There would never have been a war without the US fueling people who would fight for us to fight that war. That doesn't mean they all wanted the communists. They didn't. But they were not going to risk their lives and fight them, these nationalists who had defeated the French. And so we didn't have a chance. That meant to me that everyone who died on both sides, not just the civilians, but the soldiers on both sides, had died an unjustified death at US decision-making. It was deliberate US mass homicide, which meant to me mass murder. And I thought, this is not something I can work now to help our people get out of gracefully and within a few years and not lose any face here and so forth. I can't participate in murder anymore. And then the other thing was, the other epiphany was hearing Randy Keeler here announced that he was going to prison to make his strongest protest against the war, which revealed to me I could do what he did. And if my going to prison for putting out the Pentagon Papers might help possibly shorten this war, it was worth it. So that was the first epiphany was that this was murder, not just a mistake, not just an error. By the way, I heard the error, it was repeated just the other day, the word error, if I may say, by Nancy Pelosi explaining why she did not push for impeachment in 2007, when the Democrats took over. She became the head of the House. And this was in the TV the other day because the head of the Judiciary Committee was John Conyers, who just died. My congressman from Michigan, from Detroit. And Conyers had prepared articles of impeachment for a number of things for George W. Bush, including the aggression against Iraq. Nancy Pelosi told him there will be no impeachment, and he went along with that. She didn't want to lose the election in 2008 to a Republican by having brought Republicans to the polls. She was still worried about that earlier this year, remember, for the next election. Impeachment will just risk our election. But that impeachment for aggression in Iraq, what really struck me was the reason she gave for not going for it. She said, I don't believe in impeaching for an error in policy. in policy. Now remember, what we have here now is a clear-cut case of extortion, abuse of office, domestic crime, abuse of office for personal gain for the election, clear-cut domestic crime, like going into my doctor's office was a clear-cut. But the Democrats had to give up the aggression into Cambodia as an article of impeachment against Nixon because it was policy. It was foreign policy. That was bad. I believed when I saw Pelosi saying that, error in policy, there may well have been 1.5 million deaths in Iraq as a result of that. And the chaos that we've seen every day, to this day, as a result. We aren't to hold that as a high crime and misdemeanor when everybody in the government was opposing it, except some of Bush's, and then, I'm talking Iraq here now, against it. That was not a high crime and misdemeanor. That precedent is very bad, and we have it. That's what we live with. That precedent, the president can do anything. So that was the epiphany I had. That there are times to say no to a president, even if you go to jail for it. And that's what Randy Keeler did, and that's what I learned to do. Okay. Any other questions?
I'll get you next, okay?
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk today and the discussion last night.
Say it again.
Thank you so much. I have 2 short questions. The first question is, when you studied the not prevention of catastrophe, have you also studied cases where catastrophe actually was prevented? So the comparative case.
That's a very good question. I have looked at times when it could have been prevented by whistleblowers. Almost every case of a civil, domestic, or foreign catastrophe, and I go back to World War I, could have been avoided by authoritative people putting out the disastrous planning that was being done. And it was not ever done. So the question is, were there times? Well, I want to think about that. I haven't actually studied. I couldn't find cases of whistleblowing. Catherine Gunn acted the fastest of any whistleblower, to my knowledge, as a young woman when she saw a cable that, as she put it, we were using illegal means to start an illegal war. And what the war was, the illegality, pardon me, was going into Iraq by the British without a UN resolution authorizing it. And the US was twisting arms to get that authorization so it wouldn't be illegal, to satisfy the British. We couldn't have cared less. But Blair had said he would not go in if it was illegal. And his chief military officials had said it would be illegal without a second. So Catherine Gunn reads a cable this is a good example, actually. Catherine Gunn reads a cable saying, US NSA, National Security Agency, is asking her agency, the British equivalent, GCHQ, the British National Security Agency, eavesdropper on everything, to listen in on the homes and offices of all the members of the Security Council so the US could get an edge in getting this resolution, meaning, as she read it correctly, so we can blackmail them into voting with us on this. She saw that cable, took it home the next day, and 2 days later decided to give it to a reporter on this. They held on to it. It's a long story. If you look at a movie, how many have seen Official Secrets? Anybody here? Not many. It's still around, I heard, somewhere in this area, and do see it, or see it on Netflix. It's about Catherine Gunn. She did not prevent the war, but she prevented a UN vote, and we had to withdraw, because when the others learned that our CIA, when Chile learned, who had seen CIA install Pinochet, learned that we were manipulating their ambassador, blackmailing him, actually, to get him to vote. He couldn't do that. Same in Mexico, same in several other countries. They couldn't get the vote. So the effect was She did prevent a UN vote that would have legalized the war. Unfortunately, didn't prevent the war. But she was one person who risked jail and was facing jail as a result of the British Official Secrets Act, and acted in a timely way, unlike me. She did in 2003 what I wish I had done in 1964. And what I'm telling people to follow Catherine Gunn, not my earlier behavior, do it in a timely way. Now, right now, well, we've got a president who is up for impeachment, probably going to be impeached, that is, indicted by the House on a partisan vote. It will unfortunately be to the shame of the Republicans, for a clear-cut domestic crime, an abuse of power. Is it the worst thing that any president has done? Not at all. Is it the worst thing he's done? Not at all. Climate? No, I mean, withdrawing from the climate Paris negotiations, withdrawing from the NIF treaty, all these things, the climate thing, incredibly larger and hard to find. It should be regarded as a high crime and misdemeanor because it is, after all, a crime against humanity. No question. But would the Congress recognize that? No, not even the Democrats would come that because they want their presidents to have that freedom as well. But however, the reason I think it's important to go ahead with this is it's important not to go along with the precedent that a president who not only has been caught clearly committing a crime, which is rare, with testimony and documents, but clearly that is part of a policy that he regards himself as above the law, absolutely. As did Nixon, who said, when the president does it, it's not illegal. But the president said that about going into my psychiatrist's office after he was out of office. He did not say that in office, though he believed it. Trump, the difference is he says things that the others say only in private. And that goes for anti-Semitism, for, in the case of Nixon, Jew, against me. Jews are born traitors. They'll get you every time, and so forth. Long story. But he said it in private. And only he knew he was being taped when he did. This president commits crimes with 12 people on the phone. 12 people on the phone. And the point is, this is not the first or the only one. He believes he's above the law, and he acts as if he does. And if the Democrats go along with the Republicans in saying, for political benefits in 2020, we will not call him a criminal or impeach him, that's a precedent that, say goodbye to democracy, essentially. They've really got to rise up to their obligations. And really, even the Republicans are getting nervous on this one, but they are acting shamefully. I just read Noam Chomsky, my friend, an hour ago, 2 hours ago, saying, look, people call me extreme for saying this. Noam says, you may call it, he says, the Republican Party is the most dangerous organization in the history of humanity. At this point. They are devoted to putting as much CO2 in the atmosphere as possible, as fast as possible, taking off regulations, having an arms race renewed as fast as possible. They are threatening the survival of humanity, which no other organization in history has consciously, explicitly done, and that is what they are doing. Does that mean the Democrats are okay? No. What they would do on climate, I think, is almost certainly going to be extremely inadequate. But they won't be leading the world in exactly the wrong direction on this, and on arms the same way. So there's no choice there.
So I'm afraid we're out of time. Once again, thank you very much, Dan Ellsberg.